This is History of Sexuality in the U.S., Lecture 2D, Part 2, talking about the foundations of Reconstruction. Reconstruction meant different things to different people, and as African American history scholar Robert Eng said, it began for each individual when freedom came. Whenever they escaped the plantation, when they escaped across Union lines, or when Union soldiers arrived in their community. And Reconstruction began when freedom began and ended as soon as the opportunities to fully enjoy those freedoms were closed down. Because as soon as Union troops would leave an area, very often the system of white supremacy, something that looked a lot like that old system of slavery, quickly roared back to life. From about 1865 to about 1877, most of the former Confederacy was under some form of military occupation and some form of outside control. During that time, there was a flourishing of African American freedoms. A number of black men served as congressmen and senators. They had a lot of involvement in the political process and experienced a brief window of economic freedom. Their freedoms were much more expansive than those of black women, and in many ways, the expansion of black men's rights was often tied to an assertion of patriarchal power over black women. At the same time, we want to understand that there was a lot of important changes that reverberated long past the 1860s and 1870s. And one of the biggest effects of Reconstruction, right, which in some ways is a failed project, right? It's a failed attempt to move away from that plantation system towards a new order that falls apart. But at the same time, it gives birth to three important pieces of law, three constitutional amendments that remain in force and remain really important to thinking about freedom, citizenship, and political participation today. The 13th Amendment ends the practice of slavery in this country, except in cases where someone is convicted of a crime. Now this is important, this is huge, this is the base of getting rid of the system of slavery, to abolish involuntary servitude. But at the same time, this loophole is quite massive. To say that you can make people serve involuntary labor and take their labor for free when they've been convicted of a crime is going to mean that southern states adopt a huge amount of new laws. They called them black codes, and they were laws that criminalized everyday behavior in ways that allowed them to re-enslave African Americans, to take their labor again for free on some of the same plantations and gangs that they were once forced to work on. The 14th Amendment is a very, very complex law, and there's a lot to be said about it, and there's an ongoing conversation in legal communities about what it means. You may remember that in recent years, some officials in the current administration in the White House talked about repealing the 14th Amendment. And that's because one of the most important parts of it is birthright citizenship. The 14th Amendment says if you're born within the borders of the United States, then you are a citizen of the United States as well as the state in which you were born. This was a way to turn 4 million people of African descent who were not citizens into citizens with one mark of the pen. But it also is going to have really important consequences in terms of thinking about sexuality, because it means when a child is born in the United States, regardless of the identity of the mother, the citizenship of the mother, the race of the mother, that child is a citizen. And then that is going to provoke a lot of sharp debate over immigration as time goes on. Two other important parts of the 14th Amendment: equal protection and due process. These are guarantees that aren't exactly enforced for decades and decades, right? We see that black people suffer from very unequal protection and processes that are often subverted and don't go the way they should. That being said, this is going to be the basis for an expansion of civil rights in the 1960s and is also used to undergird later arguments about marriage equality and rights for other sexual minorities. Last but certainly not least, the 15th Amendment guarantees that voting rights won't be restricted on the basis of race. Again, we can see that in the reality of Reconstruction, and especially after the formal end of Reconstruction, many of these rights are abused, are chipped away at, or are taken and interpreted in very perverse ways. But at the same time, they provide an important legal basis for the growing African American civil rights struggle, as well as the struggle for civil rights for all people excluded from the charmed circle of white male patriarchy. Keep watching and keep listening as we talk in the next video about the connections between Reconstruction and expansion.